Good afternoon, everyone. Bill C-7 passed in the Senate yesterday, and it didn't just pass as the bill, as bad as it was from Parliament, it was amended by the Senate. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the amendments. Well, we'll first talk about what the original bill said, and then we'll talk about the amendments, and we'll talk about where to go from here. What's important about this situation is that it's still possible because the members of Parliament will get a second vote, another vote on Bill C-7. They might reject the amendments. They might actually reject the bill itself because they have to vote on the bill now that it's been amended. They have to vote on the bill again. None of this actually, in a sense, surprises me as much as it saddens me because of the fact that, there was a lot of talk already about these issues. You might remember that we haven't had the 5-year review yet, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, and the importance of the fact that we haven't even reviewed the original bill. Today I have with me Amy Hasbrook, and she's the president of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, but she is also the founder of Toujours Vivant Not Dead Yet, which is a disability rights group. Amy is a lawyer by training, but she's more so an activist now than anything else. Nonetheless, Amy is someone who's going to go through then the language of the original bill a little bit, and of course the amendments. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. I want you to know that there's things that we can still do, but we continue to work in this important issue because we have hope that the culture can change, that our country can change, and that silence is certainly not our friend. So I'm going to pass it over to Amy, who is going to now first go through the information about Bill C-7 itself.
Great, thanks. Okay, one of the reasons that Bill C-7 was introduced at all was because of the Truchon decision, and that happened in September of 2019. And basically the Truchon decision said that people whose deaths were not reasonably foreseeable, i.e. people with long-term disabilities, were deprived of their charter rights because the law as it existed discriminated against them. But in fact, even without that, the medical aid in dying or euthanasia law always affected disabled people more than any other population, because regardless of whether a person had a terminal illness or not, medical aid in dying, everybody who requests and receives medical aid in dying has a disability. So even though technically it was supposed to be only for people whose deaths were reasonably foreseeable before September of 2019, in actual fact, the euthanasia law in Canada was really everybody who was affected by that law had a disability, and that was the important thing. So now that Bill C-7, what Bill C-7 is doing is just formalizing that process of applying the law to people with disabilities. So Bill C-7 facilitates abuse as originally written, and it decreases the number of witnesses from 2 to 1. And so in order to make an application, you have to have one witness, and that witness can be an attendant. And so that sets up a situation where an abusive attendant can coerce a person to ask for a death and then be the only witness to the written request. And during the amendment process, during the third reading, somebody proposed an amendment to switch that back to how it was in the original law, and that amendment was defeated. Next slide.
Now, I'm going to make one little comment here, and that is that if you do a will, for instance, in Ontario, if you do your will, you go to your lawyer, the will needs to be witnessed by 2 witnesses, and they can't be people who are related to you. So usually the lawyer will have his secretary or whoever else, or her secretary, or whoever else, as the witnesses, but they can't be related to you. And this is an important thing, that here they're allowing death with only 1 witness, and it could be, the sole witness could be your attendant.
Yeah. Okay, next slide.
Yep.
Okay. The Bill C-7 creates two tracks. One that's supposedly reserved for people whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable, and the other is for people whose deaths are not reasonably foreseeable. So on the fast track to death, if your death is reasonably foreseeable, it eliminates the 10-day reflection period, so that that doesn't give enough time for antidepressants or other drugs to take effect, or to get the right dosage of pain medications. And in fact, most interventions that people would need, such as palliative care, any kind of social assistance a person might need, there wouldn't be enough time. They would be euthanized faster than they would get other interventions. The other thing that it does on the fast track is that it waives the consent that was formerly required when euthanasia was administered. So it creates a de facto advance directive. So even though later on we'll talk about an amendment that created an advance directive for people on the slow track, this created one for people on the fast track. And the person has to demonstrate a refusal if they don't want, if they've scheduled their euthanasia and then they change their mind, they have to demonstrate refusal. And if they were to say, if the doctor were to start the process for injection, the person said, no, 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 no. It's not clear whether that would be enough to be refusal, because the doctor could say that that was involuntary words. And it's not clear if that would constitute refusal. And again, there was an attempt to clarify that and eliminate that slippery part of the statute in the amendment process, but that was struck down. The other thing to remember is there was a case in the Netherlands where a woman had said she wanted euthanasia, but she wanted to be able to say when she was ready, and her doctor decided that she should be ready. And so the doctor put a sedative in her coffee and had her family hold her down to get the injection, despite the fact that she fought back against it. So that would have been a situation, that kind of situation can now happen in Canada. Next slide.
So the key was that there was no consent at the time of death,
right,
in Bill C-7 that was necessary if you had already had scheduled that euthanasia.
Yeah. On the slow track to death, your death must, if your death is not reasonably foreseeable, which is a term that, though it reappears in Bill C-7, is still not defined in any legal context. It provides for a 90-day reflection period that will probably be challenged in court and will probably be struck down as discriminatory. And either way, it can be waived for any shorter period. And the amendment would waive that final consent. The amendment we're going to talk about in a little bit. Next slide. All right. One of the, also, while still on the slow track to death, the medical practitioner is supposed to ensure that the person has been informed of the means available to relieve their suffering, including counseling services, mental health and disability support services, that they be offered consultation with the relevant professionals. So that doesn't ensure that the person gets the services. It doesn't ensure that the person even is offered the services, and it certainly doesn't ensure that the services are adequate. Next slide.
Yeah, it just means it has to be informed, yes.
Right, so the medical professional decides what supports are appropriate for the person, not the person deciding those, which services are appropriate. They're only offered to people who are at the end of life, who are not at the end of life. So what if a person at the end of life needs those same services? Being informed and offered consultations, as I said, are not the same as receiving the services and that meet the person's need. And importantly, there is still no suicide prevention requirement in Bill C-7, and nor was there one in Bill C-14, and that still violates the spirit of the idea of having an end-of-life care bill. Next slide.
Yeah, no requirement of any counseling or anything.
Right. Okay, still on the slow track. The medical practitioner must have expertise in the condition causing the suffering, except for it's the medical professional who defines that expertise. And so if a person has multiple sclerosis and their general practitioner has taken a 2-week seminar in treating people with multiple sclerosis, then the medical practitioner can say they're an expert in treating people with multiple sclerosis. Yeah, not so much. So it basically, as self-defined expertise isn't really expertise at all, especially if it's only one client, only one patient that the doctor has. Next slide.
I was going to make a little comment though about this slow track, and that is in the Netherlands and Belgium, there is, how would you say, a protocol. It's not written in the law, but the government has these set of protocols that the doctors must follow. If somebody is not dying, so they do allow euthanasia, of course, in the Netherlands and Belgium for people who are not dying or people who have mental illness alone. But the protocol states that the patient must try all effective medical treatments for that condition. And if the patient refuses a medical intervention that could be effective, then the doctor must say, then you do not qualify for euthanasia. On top of it, in the Netherlands and Belgium, they say there must be a 1 year, they talk about the 1 year waiting period, or that 1 year of trying medical intervention. So let's say someone has euthanasia, wants euthanasia, and they have issues around mental illness alone. They must go through 1 year of attempting to deal with their issues. And only after that 1 year, if they've tried all medical interventions, that they would qualify. Obviously in Canada, the slow track would be considered the fast track in the Netherlands.
Right, and that requirement was specifically excluded in the Bill C-14, the original MAID law, and it is not added in Bill C-7. Okay. The First Amendment adopted would allow MAID requests to be people to make a request for euthanasia before the diagnosis, and to waive the requirement for the final consent in the case of people on the slow track. And the reason this first part is important is if we ran across a case of a person who had a mass in their abdomen, in their stomach, and they went and they didn't have a final diagnosis, but they said, I want to be euthanized. And their oncologist said, well, we need to figure out what's going on here. What is this mass, and decide if we can treat it. Maybe we can remove it, or maybe we can shrink it, or what. But no, the person insisted that they wanted euthanasia, and they got it. And this amendment would allow that kind of request and receipt of euthanasia before even a diagnosis is made. So what if that person could have had that mass removed and they could have lived 20 more years? Well, too bad, so sad, they had euthanasia. And also, again, this amendment allows that if a person, even a person who is on the slow track can make an appointment for euthanasia and then have the euthanasia without having to give that final consent. And that is a recipe for abuse. Next slide.
Absolutely. Because you would put it in your power of attorney that this is what you would want. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Now, here's something that is incredibly confusing. The original Bill C-7 said, oh, we don't want to have MAID for people who just have a mental illness. And then they put in this amendment that said, oh, we eventually want to have MAID for people who only have a mental illness, except for there's going to be an exception for, we're going to wait 18 months before that's implemented, but the delay doesn't apply to people with neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease. And so that's what came, they basically did a 180. And one of the things Alex had pointed out is the original, their original idea to exclude people with mental illness wouldn't have worked anyway, because people could have euthanasia if they simply said they had psychological suffering, and that would be enough. And so they're just allowing something that was in the law anyway. And if you've noticed, when Bill C-14 was passed, they originally said that there would be 3 areas, potential areas of expansion that would be explored. One, to allow MAID for people who only have a psychiatric disability, one for advanced directives, and one for mature minors. And Bill C-7 with these amendments knocks out 2 of those. So, oh well, so much for study and review. Next slide.
I just want to clarify, because so what the Senate has done is they're saying that you could have euthanasia for mental illness alone, but there's going to be this 18-month waiting period before it actually would take effect, to give Parliament a chance to come up with quote unquote rules. Now, they said it doesn't apply to neurodegenerative conditions, but it didn't make sense them saying that. I think they did that for media reasons or something, because in fact euthanasia was already being applied for neurodegenerative conditions. So by putting that in there, it's almost like they're trying to change the direction of how people are thinking of this amendment. But on top of it, it's exactly what Amy said, what I've been always arguing. The previous bill allowed euthanasia for physical or psychological suffering, but didn't define psychological suffering. So therefore, I was considered an outlier, because I was saying, well, the bill already allows euthanasia for mental illness under the term psychological suffering. And of course, this just makes it more clear. So the sad thing is that this makes it so clear that it's going to become more common, but I'm suggesting that in fact, the previous version allowed it. It just allowed it through a lack of definition.
Okay. Another amendment that was adopted, which is actually a good one, and I can tell you who we can thank for that, and we can thank Nahid Dosani and Sarah Jama. Nahid Dosani is a palliative care doc and outreach worker, and he testified on February 1st. I think it was, anyway, sometime around then. I think it was February 1st that he testified. And Sarah Jama is a woman with cerebral palsy who is head of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario. And they are both people of color, and both of them brought up a point that I raised when I made my comments on the proposed monitoring system, that they're not tracking race-based data, and so there's no way to track the fact that euthanasia and assisted suicide have a disproportionate effect on people of color. I was ignored, but because they're people of color and they said it, they weren't ignored. And so fortunately, this amendment was adopted. And the amendment basically provides that in the collection of data, race and ethnicity will be counted. And there was also a letter from a group of Indigenous leaders saying that they were not sufficiently consulted. This is not within consistent with our belief systems, and we don't want this shoved down our throats. So it was due to that activism that this amendment got through, I think, in my opinion.
What's missing, as you would acknowledge, is that the disability side is what's missing, because
Right.
what's interesting is when we look at data from the Netherlands, Belgium, and Oregon, Washington, etc., you notice that the people who tend to die by euthanasia or assisted suicide tend to be white, highly educated, etc. So we'll see what happens with this. But nonetheless, the point is the greater issue of disability seems to be still missing.
Right. The other positive amendment that came out of the third reading was that there will be a committee to conduct a thorough review of the MAID law. And that was due, I think, in part to an open letter that we sent to members of Parliament, basically saying you need to conduct a thorough review of the MAID law as required by Bill C-14. So that was a positive outcome. They have to form the committee within 30 days of Bill C-7 receiving royal assent. The committee will have to perform a comprehensive review, which hopefully is going to sidestep what Attorney General Lametti was going to try to do just by expanding the study of the 3 areas of expansion, which is actually moot now because 2 of them are already covered. And the committee has to submit its report within 6 months, which is actually kind of a short time delay. So we're going to really, as activists, have to get our ducks in a row to be prepared to submit very strong testimony to that committee. Next slide.
For your information, we're actually working on this issue already,
Yes.
the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and we have someone who's doing a lot of research right now. So we hope to be capable of providing a full, in-depth information for the government on this issue.
Yes. Okay, some of the amendments that were rejected were one to protect providers' conscience rights. And though that shouldn't have been necessary because it's also included in Bill C-14, the fact is that in Ontario especially, but also in other jurisdictions, providers have been forced to not only perform euthanasia, but also to refer people for euthanasia. An amendment that would have required that the person initiate the conversation about euthanasia rather than the doctor. So to decrease the amount of pressure brought to bear by the doctor to receive euthanasia, that was rejected. The attempt to restore the second witness was rejected, and repeal of the provision whereby involuntary words don't count as refusal. Next slide.
So I'll take over here.
Yep.
Were the amendments a surprise? And so on November 24th, and I think we've already made reference to this, Justice Minister David Lametti told the Senate committee that was doing the pre-study of Bill C-7 that he wanted to expand the euthanasia law to allow for euthanasia for mental illness alone. So the fact is this was already big time on the radar that the Justice Minister was wanting euthanasia for mental illness alone. So the fact that there would be an amendment for this was not overly surprising. The amendment about the other issue being the that you could put it in your advance directive is more surprising. Now, let me tell you why that's more surprising. First of all, we've not done the 5-year review. Secondly, the Senate or Parliament had not called any witnesses to look at this issue of having a euthanasia request in your advance directive. So they've not done any research. They've not done any looking at the question ahead of time. But it was Pamela Wallin Senator Pamela Wallin, you might remember she was a media star in Canada previous to being appointed to the Senate. She was the one who proposed the amendment, and it passed. Lametti's also been saying that the topic of debate when Parliament does the 5-year review would be limited. So we need, first of all, I say, well, there hasn't been a 5-year review and there was supposed to be. But secondly, the Senate, I'm suggesting, has taken away some of that issue of the 5-year review because as was being said by Amy, that 2 of the amendments were part of what they were planning to review, the issue of advanced directives and the issue of euthanasia for mental illness alone. I say here, maybe the Senate was working with Lametti on the amendments. It wouldn't surprise me. I'm just saying that. No one, so if you're going to say that it's true, I don't know if it's true, but Alex is saying it looks too comfortable to be that it for surety wasn't happening.
It doesn't
Bill C-7 required. It doesn't pass the smell test. That's exactly it. Bill C-14 required Parliament to begin a 5-year review of the law, which was to begin in June of 2020. So that was already legislated, and it didn't happen. I was at first surprised that they were planning to do all these amendments through Bill C-7 without first reviewing the law. Like, I can understand that they didn't appeal. Actually, I don't understand that they didn't appeal the Truchon decision in Quebec. Nonetheless, by not appealing it, I can understand that they were presenting legislation that would amend the law based on Truchon. But of course, they went much further. Lametti had stated that the review would consider expanding euthanasia to mental illness alone, consent via advanced directives, and mature minors. They also wanted to study palliative care. So what they, as I say, the Senate's done is mental illness alone and consent via advanced directives. So if as I say, if Bill C-7 as amended is now approved by Parliament, all that's left is the issue of mature minors. Sadly, if you follow my information, you know that the Netherlands is right now talking about expanding euthanasia to mature minors. Passing the amendment without first studying these issues is irresponsible at best.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think it's much worse than that. Once euthanasia was legalized, the only question remaining is who can do the killing based on what circumstances. This is what's happened. Once you allowed this, so once Bill C-14 passed, once the Supreme Court made their decision and they started the process, we were sold a bill of goods when they said, oh, we're going to do this in a tight way. Well, there was always a lie. Now, how do you know it was a lie? Because the language of Bill C-14, the original legislation, was loose. The language was undefined. So obviously, by not defining the language, when we're telling you this is a tight legislation, this is legislation that will be to have protections in it. The protections were never defined properly, like natural death being reasonably foreseeable was never defined. Psychological suffering was never defined. You know, there's a lot of people who go through psychological suffering, and now with this extension of the legislation, what's it going to mean? Bill C-7 will make Canada the most permissive killing jurisdiction in the world, other than we don't have mature minors yet. Now, sadly, I've already told people, and I say it again, it's no hidden secret that it's unconstitutional, and eventually there's going to be a court case striking that down based on previous decisions dealing with medical questions in Canada. We need to tell your member of Parliament that if they weren't opposed to Bill C-7 before, they should be opposed now. If they were saying to you that, oh, Bill C-7 is based on Truchon alone, and so therefore we have to, because of this Quebec court decision, pass Bill C-7, first of all, that wasn't true, and it's definitely not true now. Further to that, if they were saying it's Bill C-7 was an excellent, how would you say, compromise, and they say, oh, Canadians, we compromise, well, Bill C-7 is not a compromise now. There's nothing of a compromise that I thought before, but now it's self-evident. And the other question becomes, well, if you can expand this to people with mental illness alone, well, what's next? Because and if you can expand this by advanced directives, so therefore you don't need to consent. That's the point. Why are we so concerned about expanding it to advanced directives? No consent at the time of death. Well, give me a break. None of us are safe. None of us are safe. We need stories. So this is where we're going. So first of all, we're not giving up on the Parliament issue, and nor should you. We don't give up. But What we need more than ever is we need stories. So you might have noticed in the National Post and in the Toronto Sun last weekend, there was an ad that was published by Compassionate Community Care telling some stories as to what the concerns are with euthanasia, assisted suicide in Canada. We need stories. We're going to be once again going on that theme. If you have a story, storytelling is powerful. We're going to work on more stories as much as we can. That's exactly what we're doing also at this upcoming parliamentary review that's going to happen for sure now. The Liberals might have just forgotten about it if they had an opportunity to, or they might have dragged it a little bit longer, considering that they seem to be pushing for an election sometime either late spring or early fall. So if you push for an election and you never really set up your review committee, then guess what? The review never happens, right? Never happens. Why didn't it happen? Well, Parliament got in the way. Just never happened. But we also need to protect ourselves. We have to understand our euthanasia threatens all of our lives. We can't be innocent about this because we're all human. There's not anybody listening to this, and there's right now 44 participants. There's nobody on this presentation who does not experience difficult times in their life. We all do to different degrees. This affects us because we're human. We are emotional, psychological beings, whether we like it or not. Euthanasia affects us when we're at the lowest time of our life, and we can't be thinking that, oh, I would never decide that way. I would never think that way. What happens when I'm going through such a downtime of my life and I'm also experiencing maybe some sort of dementia at some point and I have difficult symptoms and I'm alone and I'm lonely? Who knows? You're a human being. That's the point, right? We need to be supportive of each other. We need to recognize that our friends, our family need us to care for them and to prevent euthanasia. One of the things we're going to be doing is also what I'm talking about is we already have this helpline and we get calls regularly from people on the helpline. But the other thing is now, what about families who've gone through this? I'm getting emails from people and then they say, well, I always opposed euthanasia, but then, Uncle so-and-so died by euthanasia. And well, it was really something that he wanted, and so I'm not sure how I feel anymore. Meaning once it's happened, they justify it. Well, Uncle so-and-so wasn't too bad a guy, they justify it. Well, we need to be recognizing, how do we help someone? How do we help these family members? I got an email from a woman in British Columbia. Her grandfather had died by euthanasia and she was going through great emotional suffering from it. And so we spoke to her. We spent time talking to her. She wrote it up and I published it because she was all upset also because she went to get counseling for her, how would you say, her emotional issues related to her grandfather's death. And people were saying, well, you should be happy for him. That's what he wanted. But she was grieving. Guess what? Grieving is a normal human response, but she was denied that because he died by euthanasia. So we must continue also to speak out. Silence isn't our help. Speaking out is important. Do I know what's going to happen next year, or the next year, or the next year? No. What I can say is that we, by working together and telling our stories and providing more support for each other, we should be able to make a difference, if not just protecting others, but hopefully in waking up this country. The other thing is that Canada has become the example to other countries. Other countries considering legalization, we're emphasizing the importance of, what about Canada? Use Canada as the example. People said, oh, there's no slippery slope to this. Look at Canada. We're the worst example of a slippery slope. Absolutely, without a question. If there's anybody who wants to ask some questions, that's what Pamela Wallace, Senator, did. Told the story of dementia in her family, and she cried out of the fear of this. Absolutely, that's exactly what she did. They said that she was very powerful in her story that she told. In pain, does death become normal when the hospital treats us as if it's normal? We're normalizing euthanasia right now, which is a serious problem in our country. Grieving a lost relative to euthanasia will be traumatic, creating more problems. I agree, absolutely. And if there's any more, our MPs need 2 or 3 talking points that will help them address the masses. Can you supply these points? Well, actually, I did in my article. If you email me, Marcy, I will send that to you, but I can also simplify it into a couple key points.
I would just say, we have 4 key arguments. One, that there can be no free choice to die as long as people don't have a free choice in where and how they live. That it's discriminatory to provide suicide prevention services to some people, but when they express a desire to die, but not to other people, to provide suicide completion services to other people. That's discriminatory, and that's wrong.
What I was very sad is how the Senate committee refused to accept the basic human arguments of experience that people have. And so when the disability community was speaking out as one in opposition to Bill C-7, they went on and ignored it. And they ignored it under this concept of charter rights. And that's another problem, that these parliamentarians have been told that there's a charter right to MAID, medical assistance to dying, euthanasia in Canada. It's not true. It's not true. There is simply not a charter right. I thought that the Senate just rubber stamped the House bill. Do they often extend it to this dictatorial fashion? The Senate is interesting. Usually they don't. They might ask questions of a House bill. They might suggest some changes to a House bill. Usually they do not actually make amendments, but they're fully capable of doing so. And that's what they did do. How do you think the lack of conscience protection will affect the fabric of healthcare in our country, especially in provinces like Ontario? Well, certainly the issue of conscience is being dealt with in Ontario. There's a whole battle of conscience that's absolutely necessary, because people who oppose assisted suicide euthanasia should not be in any way forced to participate. The other thing is, in Ontario, as I say, I know of several physicians who are people who I know personally who are supporters of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, have as medical practitioners who have left Ontario. And the reason they left Ontario is they just didn't want to be forced to be part of it. They didn't want to be dragged before the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons because they weren't willing to do something. Maybe they were premature in leaving Ontario. I don't know. I'm not going to judge them, but they have left Ontario for these reasons. And they feel that conscience rights are central to their practicing of medicine, and I would agree with them. Conscience rights are fundamental questions. And there's another question here about from John Kelly. Well, John Kelly is my hero. Absolutely he is. And he says, in Massachusetts, a big push for assisted suicide with terminal illness. I'd like to use Canada's example of extending it to disabled people without a reasonably foreseeable death. Yes. John Kelly, you probably have our information. And if you don't have all the information, I'm happy to send it to you. And I'm sure Amy's happy to communicate with you about what's happening, because the fact of it is Canada is not that far from Massachusetts. There's no question about it. The Americans are going slower down the line in legalizing, but I mean, it's all inevitable. Once you legalize this, the question only becomes for whom and for what reason. The other thing is sadly, I don't have to like it, but sadly, euthanasia is more effective than assisted suicide because of how it's done. And do I have any more comments?
There's 2 ways to look at. There's actually arguments on both sides of that, but yeah, they're different animals. The one thing about assisted suicide is that the person has to initiate the action themselves, and that creates a certain obligation, which results in a much lower number of people who are doing the deed in jurisdictions where only assisted suicide is allowed. So it's about 1/10 the number of people who are dying. So there is a positive side and there's a negative side, and it's not fun.
So if you have any questions whatsoever at this point, please send them to info@epcc.ca. And if it's a question for Amy, I'm happy to forward it to her without a question. I don't have time to answer everyone's questions in this world either, so I'm happy to send them to her. The second thing is, if you're not a member of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, please become a member. We're not getting thousands of dollars. We're actually not getting any money from the government. We get it from donors. Our support exists by members and people who donate to us and support us. That's how it works. It's that simple. So please email us with any other questions. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully it's been helpful.